American Federation of Musicians, Local 47 Offices, Hollywood, California, February 1948. James Petrillo, National President of the American Federation of Musicians, sat across from Local 47 business agent Harold Oxley in a meeting that would never appear in official union minutes. The subject was Nat King Cole. More specifically, the subject was Nat King Cole's upcoming Capitol Records session. The session that called for a full string section, 14 white musicians, members of Local 47. Oxley had received complaints from white Local 47 members, from their wives, from Southern bandleaders with distribution interests. The complaints were not about musical quality. They were not about union scale violation. They were about race. A black bandleader was hiring white musicians. That was the problem. We have members who are uncomfortable with the arrangement, Oxley told Petrillo. They feel it crosses a line. What line? Petrillo asked, though he understood perfectly. The line between the locals. White musicians work with white bandleaders. Negro musicians work with Negro bandleaders. That's how it's always been done. That's not written anywhere in our charter. It doesn't need to be written. It's understood. Before we dive into how the American Federation of Musicians maintained segregated union locals, Local 47 for white musicians, Local 767 for black musicians in Los Angeles, and how white union officials tried to prevent Nat King Cole from hiring white session musicians for his Capitol Records recordings, arguing that a black bandleader hiring white players crossed racial boundaries that didn't need to be written down. Let me ask, where are you? Watching from, drop a comment, because this story about union racism and the right to hire the best musicians regardless of race is as relevant in 2026 as it was in 1948. The American Federation of Musicians had been racially segregated since its founding in the late 19th century. The segregation wasn't accidental or incidental. It was structural, deliberate, and maintained through explicit policy, even when the policy was never formally written. Major cities had two AFM locals, one for white musicians, one for black musicians. In Los Angeles, Local 47 was the white local, headquartered on Vine Street, with access to the major studio recording sessions, the Hollywood film work, the high-paying commercial engagements. Local 767 was the black local, headquartered in the Central Avenue district, serving the clubs and venues of black Los Angeles. The wage scales were different, the session rates were different, the opportunities available to members were different. Local 47 musicians worked studio recording sessions that paid significantly more than the nightclub work available through Local 767. Both locals were technically part of the same national organization, but they operated as entirely separate institutions serving an explicitly segregated labor market. Nat King Cole was a member of Local 767. He joined as a young pianist coming up through the Central Avenue jazz scene. His membership was automatic. Black musicians joined Local 767. That was the structure. But as Nat's career expanded, as Capitol Records gave him sessions with increasingly sophisticated arrangements, he needed musicians beyond what Local 767 could provide: string sections, specific instrumentalists, players with classical training and studio recording experience. Those musicians were almost exclusively Local 47 members, because that's where the studio session work was, because the hierarchy of the segregated union system meant white musicians had access to the training, the studio connections, the professional networks that made them the go-to players for Capitol Records sessions. When Nat began hiring Local 47 musicians for his sessions, the arrangement was initially informal. Capitol Records handled the booking. The musicians were paid union scale. The sessions happened. But as Nat's sessions became larger, as his arrangements required more white musicians, the informal arrangement started drawing attention from Local 47 officials. The complaint wasn't contractual. Local 47 musicians working a session were following standard union procedure. They were hired, they were paid scale, they showed up and played. Nothing was being violated. The complaint was racial. A black musician was the principal artist. A black bandleader was directing the session, and white musicians were playing under his direction. That made some Local 47 members uncomfortable, made some studio musicians complain to their union representatives, created internal pressure within Local 47 to establish what they called appropriate boundaries. Harold Oxley and other Local 47 officials began raising questions about whether it was appropriate for their members to work under a black bandleader, whether there was some informal policy that should govern these arrangements, whether the union had an obligation to protect its white members from what exactly, they couldn't quite say, but they raised the questions. Capitol Records executive Lee Gillette, who produced many of Nat's sessions, was caught between the practical reality he needed these musicians for these sessions and the political reality that Local 47 was making noise about the arrangements. Lee Gillette approached the situation practically. He had albums to produce. Nat was one of Capitol's biggest stars. The sessions needed to happen. The arrangements required specific musicians. Those musicians needed to be hired. He began quietly managing the politics, talking to Local 47 officials, emphasizing that everything was contractually correct, that all musicians were being paid proper scale, that there was no technical violation of any union rule. But the Local 47 officials weren't talking about technical violations. They were talking about something more amorphous, a social order they believed the union existed to protect. Nat understood what was happening, had dealt with institutional racism his entire career, recognized this particular form using administrative and organizational pressure to achieve racial exclusion when legal exclusion wasn't possible. He approached the situation with characteristic strategic discipline, didn't create public confrontations, didn't issue public statements. Worked through proper channels while making clear he wasn't going away. Nat, through his manager Carlos Gastel, communicated directly with Local 47 officials. The message was measured but clear. There was no contractual or procedural basis for preventing him from hiring Local 47 musicians. He was the principal artist. He hired musicians. He paid union scale. That was the end of it. Carlos Gastel was particularly effective in these negotiations. As a white man managing one of Capitol's biggest stars, he had access to conversations and spaces that were less available to Nat directly. He could sit across a table from Local 47 officials and speak in terms they responded to: business terms, contract terms, commercial terms. His sessions generate significant revenue for your members, Gastel told them. They're being paid, they're working. If you prevent them from taking these sessions, you're preventing them from earning. That argument had resonance. Local 47 existed to protect its members' earning opportunities. Preventing members from taking well-paying, contractually correct work was difficult to justify on purely financial grounds. The capitulation from Local 47 was gradual and never explicitly acknowledged. There was no formal ruling, no official decision, no announcement that the informal pressure campaign had ended. The sessions just continued. Local 47 musicians continued accepting Nat's bookings. The complaints quieted, the pressure dissipated, not because anyone changed their minds about race, but because the economic argument won over the social order argument within union politics. Because the musicians who wanted to work had more practical power than the officials trying to create racial boundaries without contractual authority. The American Federation of Musicians formally integrated its locals in 1953, 5 years after the Capitol Sessions conflict. The integration was driven by a combination of NAACP pressure, legal threats, and changing national politics, not by the AFM's own initiative. The two Los Angeles locals, 47 and 767, merged into a single integrated local, white and black. Musicians became members of the same organization, with the same access to the same opportunities. But integration on paper didn't immediately change the informal practices, the hiring networks, the social relationships that determined who got which sessions. White musicians still had advantages built up over decades: studio connections, contractor relationships, reputation networks that didn't vanish because the union card said Local 47 for everyone. Nat had been navigating this reality throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, hiring the musicians he needed, fighting informal resistance, working through the politics while maintaining his recording output. His Capitol Records sessions in this period produced some of the most commercially and artistically successful recordings of his career. The Christmas Song, recorded with a string section in 1946, re-recorded again in 1953, Mona Lisa, 1950, Unforgettable, 1951, Too Young, 1951, Somewhere Along the Way, 1952. those recordings required the musicians he fought to hire. The string arrangements, the orchestral backing, the sophisticated production that characterized his capital work, none of it would have been possible if Local 47's informal resistance had succeeded. The recordings that defined his legacy were made possible partly because he refused to accept the racial boundary that union officials tried to impose without contractual authority. Other black bandleaders and artists faced similar resistance. Count Basie needed white musicians for certain arrangements. Duke Ellington's sophisticated orchestrations sometimes required session players from the white local. Each encountered versions of the same informal pressure, not explicit prohibition, but administrative friction, social discomfort, suggestions that appropriate boundaries should be maintained. The pattern revealed something about how union racism operated. The AFM couldn't legally prohibit cross-racial hiring once the arrangements were contractually correct, but it could create enough informal friction, enough social discomfort, enough political noise within the organization to discourage the practice. For artists with less commercial leverage than Nat King Cole, that friction was often enough. The path of least resistance was to hire from your own local, avoid the political complications, work within the segregated labor structure rather than fighting it. Nat had the commercial leverage to push back, had Capitol Records behind him, generating revenue that gave his side economic weight in the argument. Manager who could navigate the politics, had the professional standing to make refusing him difficult to justify publicly. But he shouldn't have needed leverage to hire qualified musicians, shouldn't have needed to fight for the right to pay union scale and receive professional musicians in return. The right to hire the best available players for a professional recording session should not have required navigating racial politics. The musicians themselves were often caught in an awkward position. White session musicians who wanted to work Nat's sessions, and they did want to because the pay was good and the sessions were high quality, faced social pressure from peers and union officials. Working for a black bandleader was acceptable. Was it crossing a line? Was it something they should avoid to maintain standing with their union colleagues? Most eventually decided the work was the work, the session was the session. Nat King Cole paid scale and ran professional, efficient recordings. That was what mattered professionally. But the fact that they had to decide that working for a black artist required any thought beyond, is this work legitimate and paid at union scale, reveals how deeply the segregated structure had shaped professional norms. Lee Gillette recalled years later that Nat never made the union politics visible during sessions. Whatever frustrations he experienced in the negotiations, whatever battles Carlos Gastel was fighting with Local 47 officials, none of it entered the recording studio. Nat showed up prepared, led the session professionally, produced excellent work. The separation between the political struggle and the creative work was characteristic. He fought for access in the places where fighting was necessary. In the studio, he just made music. That required a kind of compartmentalization that shouldn't have been necessary. The work itself, the recording, the arranging, the leading of sessions, should have been entirely separate from racial politics. The union struggle should never have existed, but it did exist. And he navigated it successfully, leaving behind recordings that required those musicians, made possible by those sessions, evidence that his fight was worth having. The integrated recordings from his Capitol years remain among the finest American popular music of the era, arrangements that required the full palette of available musicians, productions that couldn't have existed within the segregated structure that Local 47 informally tried to maintain. When you hear Unforgettable or Mona Lisa or Too Young, you're hearing the result of Nat King Cole's refusal to accept a racial boundary that had no legitimate contractual basis. Hearing what integration of the recording studio made possible. The white musicians who played those sessions did their jobs professionally, contributed to recordings that have outlasted almost everything else from their era, and Nat King Cole, who had to fight for the right to hire them, made those recordings anyway, quietly. Without public confrontation, through economic argument and professional persistence. That's how integration happened in the recording studios, not through dramatic confrontation, but through contractual correctness, economic leverage, and one black bandleader's refusal to accept informal racial boundaries that had no legitimate basis. The union card said two different locals, Nats. Sessions said something different about what was possible when commercial reality and professional standards were more powerful than informal racism trying to maintain a structure that was already, quietly, losing its grip. The AFM's segregated structure wasn't simply a collection of individual prejudices, it was institutional racism. Local 47 controlled access to the most lucrative work. Film studio sessions, major label recording dates, high-profile commercial engagements paying significantly more than club work available through Local 767. By maintaining separate locals, the AFM actively reproduced racial hierarchy, ensuring better opportunities flowed to white musicians. Professional networks remained predominantly white. The path to well-paid session work ran through the white local. A black musician who wanted access to the studio session world had to navigate. This structure had to find ways to work within it, around it, or against it. Had to have enough leverage, commercial, contractual, or otherwise, to override the informal barriers. Nat had that leverage by the late 1940s because Capitol Records needed him to succeed. His records were selling, his sessions generated revenue. The label's investment in his career meant they had practical incentives to support his ability to hire the musicians his arrangements required. But the leverage he had was contingent on commercial success. A black musician with less commercial standing would have faced the same informal resistance without the same commercial argument to deploy against it. Would have faced Local 47's pressure without Lee Gillette and Capitol Records having skin in the game. The union structure compounded existing inequalities. Black musicians, successful enough to need white session players, had enough leverage to fight for access, while those without that commercial standing faced the same barriers without resources to challenge them. The 1953 AFM integration theoretically changed this, but hiring networks, contractor relationships, and studio preferences didn't reset because union cards changed. Formal integration didn't automatically create informal integration. Nat's experience was both personal victory and demonstration of structural problem. His success represented genuine studio integration, but required his specific combination of talent, commercial success, and strategic management. The lesson wasn't that the system worked, but that it could be overcome by those with sufficient leverage, a bar set high enough to exclude most black musicians facing the same barriers. Historians focus on Nat's Capitol Records music, the recordings, arrangements, vocal performances. Less often discussed is what made those recordings possible. His quiet, persistent fight against a union structure imposing racial boundaries on his ability to hire best available musicians. That fight is part of the recording's history. Nat recorded with integrated bands when that required fighting for the right, won through contractual argument and economic leverage, made the music that resulted, music that outlasted every union official who tried to tell him who he could hire.